Hi, this is Ed Fitzpatrick. If you enjoy local politics as much as I do, be sure to join our friends at Rhode Island PBS for the show A Lively Experiment. Hosted by Jim Hummel, the weekly series features journalists, pundits, and politicians debating the stories and issues that matter most to us Rhode Islanders. Tune in to A Lively Experiment and be part of the conversation. Fridays at 7 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS and wherever you get your podcasts. From the Boston Globe, this is Rhode Island Report. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. Welcome back to the podcast where we bring you big conversations from our very small state. The election is less than a week away. Misinformation, conspiracy theories, and deepfakes are raging online. Professor Sara Sweetman from URI is working to help young people sort fact from fiction. She's here today to talk more about bringing media literacy to Rhode Island students. Professor Sara Sweetman, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I know Media Literacy Week just concluded with visits to schools in Rhode Island. So tell me how it went and what the message was.
The first thing that I'd like to say is that Media Literacy Week intention was to really get us talking about media literacy, what it means, what it looks like, how it feels in education. But it definitely shouldn't be balled up in that week. We need to continue the work as we move forward because it's so important for our youth and our educators to sort of figure this out together as media becomes more complex and we're navigating that. So Media Literacy Week was, I think, really successful. Lots of teachers at all different levels, all the way from pre-K up through grade 12 and at the college level, had some deep conversations with our students about how do you find information that is believable and how do you engage in research, whether it's a simple question about the weather at second grade or it's understanding the ballot like I did with my students who are going to vote for the first time.
You've got college students about to go to the polls on November 5th, right? So I know one presentation was about building resilient communities using media literacy to fight extremism, hate, and violence. What were some of the takeaways there?
I have a 17-year-old home, and I asked her what her biggest challenge with media was before I went to the event at Rhode Island PBS, and her response was just there's so much negative media coming at them as teenagers. And teenagers are passionate people in general, right? Their emotions are heightened, and it's challenging to see all the media that's coming at them and to emotionally be able to sort of sort through that and understand what that means for them in a bigger picture when they've only had 17 years of life experience to, relate it to. It becomes very challenging. So I think this idea of building a resilient community and especially supporting our youth as they're growing up in these very dynamic, changing times is really important. To do that, we do have to speak with them about how they're feeling, how they're growing, how, coming from their perspective is really important, and from all different community members.
What are some of the practical pieces of advice you give to your child? Or I've got a senior in high school too at home, and what would be two or three things to tell him about what he could do to avoid misinformation, to make sure he's got accurate data coming in through the whatever screen he's on?
Thinking about who the creator of the media is, what the purpose of that media was, who is it represented to, and who's missing from that representation. Having those questions to ask when you engage in any kind of text. I encourage my children and my students at URI to use sites like allsides.com to be able to see whatever they're reading, how it leans.
And what is allsides.com?
It's a fantastic website where you can put any news article or any topic into a search engine, and it will show you the results of the news headlines from far right, slight right, central, slight left, far left. And the same story is in the headlines of 5 different news articles, and you read those titles and they seem like 5 different stories, right? Even though it's the same topic. And it's really interesting to even see as a grown adult who's been navigating media for a while. And, I think I understand the biases that might go into something, but to really see the same news reported in 5 different ways and to read all 5, I think, as teachers and educators, we need to really understand. I tell my education students, we need to understand not just our own perspective, but other perspectives. And so to read all 5 news articles on the same topic gives you different perspectives that you can apply your own values and your own belief system to decide sort of where you are and what makes sense in your life.
Yeah, because I think of when I was a kid, we had the 3 major network news stations. We had the big newspapers that you would read, the local newspaper. But that's, if Walter Cronkite said that's the way it is, that's the way it is. But that's not the case today. Like, tell us about the media landscape that your students face.
That idea that I know we had the Britannica encyclopedia on our shelf at home. And if I had to write a report in K-12 schools, I went to the Britannica. I never questioned the information. I had one source to write a whole paper, right? It was probably just rewriting whatever was in there for the paper.
We had Funk and Wagnalls.
Yeah, right. And, now a very simple question can have very complex answers because we can learn. The power of media in a fantastic way is that we can learn about ideas and topics from lots of different perspectives, from lots of different writers, and sometimes from the source themselves. I think that's amazing. We never had that as youth, right? We couldn't always get to the source. We always had to have it kind of reported to us. So I think there's something amazing in that. When you're learning about something, getting as close to the original source of it as possible is everybody knows the game of telephone and what happens when you play that game at the end, right? So finding original sources is a skill that I know they're working on in the K-12 arena, and that's one of the important things students can do.
So, yeah, you raised a good point that we have all this information right in the palm of our hands with the smartphones. But how much of that information is misinformation now or disinformation, even worse?
Our college-age youth are very aware that is the case. That's a great thing, that they're aware more so than maybe the generations before.
That's a great point because I saw a study published in Science Advances found that social media users over 65 shared nearly 7 times as many articles from fake news domains as the youngest age group. So did the kids get it? And do they just need to talk to their parents or their grandparents?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I said to my class last week. We looked at a ballot and looked up information on each of the Rhode Island approve, reject on the back end of the ballot. And we looked up the articles. We asked questions about those articles, like who wrote it, what was the audience, who was missing. We went through the questions that we talked a lot about during Media Literacy Week. And then from the point of an educator, we're sort of coming to ideas on how they would vote from the role that they're looking to go into, not necessarily personally. But the message at the end was to go home and talk with your parents, because I do think that there's some like evening of the playing field, right? The media, new technologies that are coming out, our younger generation have a little bit more of a handle on some of them. We didn't grow up with quite as much visual data as our youth have, and they're a little better at reading and interpreting visual data than the older generations. And so there's a lot that we can learn from them.
Yeah, earlier this year, New Hampshire voters received a message imitating the voice of President Biden and urging them not to vote in that Democratic primary. So what can people do to avoid being fooled by deepfakes?
We have to use some logic. We have to go back to our values and our knowledge about the world and how it works and question, right? I really think it comes down to questioning what they're seeing and being in the habit. We can start that habit all the way from 5 years old, in the habit of asking, who posted this? Where did it come from? Who is it aimed at? What's the purpose of it? And who is it not aiming at? And I think those questions are really important, especially at the speed of which we communicate today.
Yeah. And what are the implications for that all that faulty information, the deepfakes and the misinformation out there when we're here in another election year, about to go to the polls on November 5th in a presidential election?
The youth that I work with at the university are very passionate about the election. We looked at a ballot in my very last class that I taught, and I have never had quite such high engagement of college students. It was an amazing class where they were very passionate about what's happening, which is really encouraging. I do think that helping our students and starting young with this is really important. Helping our students know that messages are conveyed for lots of different reasons. And when we understand that messages are conveyed for lots of reasons, they're not always conveyed just to tell the truth. They can start to learn to be critical thinkers, critical consumers of media. And that really goes back to that inquiry and asking questions about it. That's so important.
Yeah, become a critical thinker seems to be the bottom line, right? We'll have more with Sara Sweetman after a quick break. When you want to go beyond the headlines, let me recommend Rhode Island PBS Weekly. Rhode Island PBS Weekly is an award-winning news magazine broadcast that gives you the full story, powered by investigative journalism and narrative storytelling. New episodes of Rhode Island PBS Weekly drop Sundays at 7:30 p.m. on Rhode Island PBS. Watch past episodes at ripbs.org/weekly. That's ripbs.org/weekly. NBC News reports that Elon Musk's social media app X is supercharging the spread of voter fraud conspiracy theories with the help of AI. And Musk himself recently berated FEMA's response to Hurricane Helene, repeatedly sharing false claims about federal workers blocking aid. So how do these attempts at promoting media literacy compete with this kind of industrial-grade misinformation and disinformation?
That's a really great question, because when I think about the idea of media literacy, we're talking about educating the public about media, right? To gain literacy, to gain understanding of how to interpret messages and how to engage with the media with purpose and, intention that of what you want to do with it. That's hard for even the educators and the adults who are trying to figure this out. There's so much challenging information right now in the world that we might all feel a little off kilter. And so I would worry that educators get fearful of educating their students because they also feel a little that is challenging them. The conversation is better than no conversation. We really need to be having conversations between educators and students and opening up news articles and working through it together. If something makes you question, if something makes you wonder when you're reading it, that it doesn't quite fit the norm, that's a great article to bring up to your students and to work through it together. And how do we find out information? And my students at the collegiate level, they had lots of good ideas about how to look at articles critically and different ways to sort of test that information and news. I
saw you on Generation Rising on Rhode Island PBS, and you said that technology is redefining what it means to be literate. How so?
So if you look up in the dictionary right now, what it means to be literate will tell you to read and write. And that is definitely not the case. As we develop, students at the college level are more likely, they get about 90% of their information from YouTube.
From YouTube? 90%? Mm-hmm. Wow. Not the Globe, you're telling me.
Well, hopefully we're teaching them to use lots of different sources. That's one of the things I do think that children understand is the multiple sources are good, right? Getting our information from multiple sources. But they do tend to go toward YouTube. Their viewing, listening skills are increasing, along with we need to continue to work on reading and writing, but viewing, listening, and then that idea of that we have multimedia coming at us constantly and in different forms. And so it's transecting across the different forms of media that learning how to read pictures, and at the same time that you're listening, sometimes the messages don't match, and we have to understand how to take multiple messages in multiple different ways and make sense of that. And what it means to be literate is definitely changing.
So with the election coming up on November 5th, can you give us some advice about what we can do as we consume media?
Yes, I think just like when we think about what's so critical or what we're teaching our students and the community is to really be a critical consumer of media. It's important to ask the questions. I know I've mentioned a few times the idea of asking who is producing, who's developing that media, where's it coming from, and what is their mission? Who are they aiming it at, and who are they not aiming it at? One of my students had said when we were looking at the ballots, she said, well, if I can't find information, then they're not aiming that information at me. And what does that say? And that student, really made me think about that idea of they're not targeting college students. So what is that political stance saying about the community of college students? And they were feeling that when they were having a hard time in their own media sites and where they go, having a hard time finding information. So I think it's really important to ask those questions, to think critically about the media we consume. We learn through social constructivism. So I do think it's important for us to share our thinking and to be really open to listening to other people's thinking and not to take what somebody else says, but to take that information and turn it into a question that you can then investigate more deeply.
Good advice, Professor Sara Sweetman. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you for having me.
Rhode Island Report is a production of the Boston Globe in collaboration with Rhode Island PBS. Today's episode was produced by Megan Hall. Audio mixing and mastering by Marissa Ewing of Hemlock Creek Productions. Our music is from APM. Be sure to follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'm Ed Fitzpatrick. See you next week. Looking to binge watch all your favorite PBS shows? You need Rhode Island PBS Passport. Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, Rhode Island PBS Weekly, and many more. Watch them all, anytime, and from any streaming device. Learn more about this member benefit at ripbs.org/passport. That's ripbs.org/passport.